User authentication. In this nugget, we'll be discussing user authentication, which is critical, and we'll have to first of all understand the user account itself. You can create a user account quite simply, and we'll show you how to do that through a Next Finish wizard, but it doesn't give you all the options that are available. So I'll show you the other options that are available when you create a user account and look at the properties of that account. And then we'll look at the profiles, which seems like it's just a user preferential issue, what kind of screensaver they have and all that kind of stuff, but it does lend to productivity because they're accustomed to a certain environment. There's 4 different kinds of profiles you can use, and we'll look at those as well as the home directory. Now, the home directory is going to be critical because you want to centralize your data. The home directory can help you do that, especially when you correlate that with My Documents. And then we'll take a look at the various security settings as well, because it's important to configure a secure setting for a user's password policy. And that's all going to be contained in a group policy object. And then we can also take a look at smart cards, which are physical devices that we use to log on. And it's 2-factor authentication because it requires both something that the user knows, their password, or a PIN as it's called with smart cards, and something that they possess, that is the smart card itself. In this nugget, we'll be discussing the fundamentals of user accounts. We'll just be looking at some of the basic properties of the user accounts. That's because it's not part of the objective for this particular exam pack to look at a lot more detail on that, such as how to mass create dozens or hundreds of accounts at once. Although that is one of the objectives for the 70-290 exam pack. So if you want to learn more about that, you can either get that exam pack or you can go to www.nuggetlab.com on the public internet. And then I have several accompanying files on how to mass create the files. There's batch files, Excel spreadsheets, all kinds of other things that I think will be very useful for you if you want to explore that a little bit more on your own. And again, they're available to you on www.nuggetlab.com. But for our purposes, we're just going to go to Active Directory users and computers and take a look at some of the fundamentals here. So as for creating a user account, we simply right-click and choose New User here, and then we can just enter in some information. And here I've entered in a username Samuel Mells, or Smells. Aren't I clever today? Anyway, so Smells is our username here. We're going to go ahead and click on Next, and then we enter in a password. Now, this will be a password that the administrator knows, at least when you initially create this account. By default, with a domain, the minimum length is going to be 6 characters, although we normally recommend that you change that to at least 7 in your domain policies. And we'll be looking at those a little bit later on. And they should also be complex, alphanumeric, upper, lowercase, special characters, things of this nature. So we'll just go ahead and enter in a password here. This will be a password that I have to share with the user, so there's 2 people that know it at this time, the administrator and the user. And then I would also recommend you leave this checked. That way you have plausible deniability, because when the user logs on using this password for the first time, then they change it to whatever password of their choice is. And then you have plausible deniability from that point forward, because you can't ever be accused as logging on as that user because you no longer know that password. Then we can also set it up so that the user cannot change the password. That might be useful for a public use account, such as something in a public library or something like that, where you have everybody logging on with the same username and password, and you wouldn't want someone to change it and affect other people that are trying to log on using that same account. Or you might do that for a service account as well. And then the password never expires also is useful for a service account. You don't want to do that for, however, sensitive users. That doesn't mean users that cry easily. That means that users that have security sensitivity, because you want them to change their password on a regular basis to help limit the scope of time that a potential hacker could compromise that account. Same thing is true if the account is disabled. If you create a new user account, maybe you got a user starting work here in 5 days. Well, as soon as I create it, I'll disable this account. That way, between now and the time the user starts, there's nobody that can possibly compromise this account because you can't log on as this account. And then on the user's first day at work, of course, I would clear this and allow the account to be enabled. And then we just go ahead and click on Next, and then we click on Finish. But notice there's a lot of stuff missing. I mean, what security groups is this user a member of? Did I just make them a domain admin? Are they domain users? What are they? Well, just to give you a clue, they are domain users, and that's all they're a member of for the time being. All those other attributes are not available until the object is actually created, and then we can go ahead and work with it. So you can do that by double-clicking on it. And then you see a whole bunch of other attributes we can fill in here, which most of which explain themselves pretty well, such as your address, information about the account, what logon hours they can log on during. It might be useful for highly restricted accounts that we want to only log on during certain, business hours or something like that, so we could select all of this and deny all of this except for during the business hours, whatever that is. Maybe these are our business hours, something like that. And that, again, is a security issue because it will limit the scope of time that someone can potentially compromise this account. So even if someone successfully compromised it, for example, they could not log on Monday at, 3 a.m. or something like that. Okay, other things we have here are log on to. This specifies which computers they can log on to, and you can enter in computers in here. And this would be also very useful for perhaps temporary employees that are only supposed to be able to use certain computers. You don't want them roaming to other people's cubicles and potentially logging onto their computers and accessing local files on those computers, for example. Here are several other various account options, most of which are self-explanatory, but I'll address a couple of them with you. First, let's look at store password using reversible encryption. This is a method by which the password is actually stored on the local computer, and since it's reversible encryption, that means that anybody that has some capabilities with this can reverse encrypt it and determine exactly what that password is. That has obvious security weaknesses. Now, the method that you're going to be using where you might have to use that is if you're using Macintosh computers, because they may need to store the password in the reversible encrypted form because they need to be able to read the password locally in order to grant you access to certain resources. Number two might be if you're using CHAP authentication over an IAS server. IAS relates to remote access services, and CHAP is a very basic authentication protocol. It's not very good at all, much more secure solutions than CHAP. And then thirdly, if you're using digest authentication to authenticate against an IIS server. Now, there are more secure methods for all of those things than the ones I just mentioned. So you don't want to use any of those things if at all possible, especially don't ever use a Macintosh computer. All right, let's take a look at some of these other things here as well. The smart card is required for interactive logon. You can also configure that in a computer policy. We'll be looking at policies later on in this series. And we'll also be discussing smart cards a little bit later on here as well. Smart cards are credit card-sized devices with chips on them which can store things such as certificates that are used to authenticate user logon. We can also make sure that the account is sensitive and cannot be delegated. This simply means that if a user has limited access to a folder, let's say, but they use an application that uses a service, and the service has full access to that folder, well then transparently through that service, the user might be granted full access to that folder, and that might not be desirable. So you could deselect this checkbox for that kind of a thing. They can also use data encryption standard. Some people call it digital encryption standard. Really, it's data encryption standard types for this account. There's several different bit lengths for DES, and it's a very secure method for encryption. And you can not require Kerberos pre-authentication if you want. Again, that would be insecure to select that checkbox because Kerberos pre-authentication is a highly secure method for authenticating that you are indeed who you say you are. And then you can set the account to expire after a certain period of time. Maybe if you have a temporary employee that's on a 2-month contract, then you can set it to expire at the end of their contract. Now, as for the rest of these, profile we'll be discussing again in a little bit more detail shortly here, so I'll just leave that one for now. Telephones explains itself as well as organization. Member of is where you're going to add this user to other security groups. Now, when you create a new user account, by default it goes into domain users. And if you need to provide access to other resources based on their group membership, of course, you can change it here. And then there's a dial-in tab here where you can control access through remote access policy, which is the default as long as the Windows Server 2003 domain functional level is Windows 2000 native or greater. If you're operating at a mixed functional level, then it's going to be set by default to deny access. And ultimately, these are the same things because there's something called a remote access policy that will appear on a remote access server, a Microsoft remote access server. And by default, it denies access anyway. So in essence, we're really working with the same thing in that respect. And then, of course, you can allow access as well. And then there are certain caller ID things. You can verify caller ID for this user to make sure that when they dial into the RAS server, if it's capable of recognizing caller ID features, probably through specialized hardware, then it's going to be able to allow this user to dial in. But only if they dial in from a pre-configured number that you specify in this text box here. And then you can also configure whether you want a callback to take place or not. No callback is by default. Set by caller means that when they dial in, they can specify what number to call back to. And then you can also specify within the account here to always call back to a specific number. That way you can guarantee that you are indeed calling that user's phone number back and that there's not somebody from Bangladesh that's impersonating that user. And you can also apply static routes if you want to custom configure the route that the dial-in access goes through, as well as assigning a static IP address just for purposes of the dial-in attempt. Then the rest of these tabs all relate to terminal services. They're not part of our discussion, but it would be the environment, sessions, and remote control tabs all relate to, again, terminal services, as well as the terminal services profile tab. Well, I mentioned that I was going to talk about your user profile a little bit more when we got a second here, so let's go ahead and address what that is. That's pretty much your entire user environment. What kind of mouse pointer I choose, screensaver, what kind of color schemes I have, any little icons in the quick launch area down here, any icons I put on the desktop, whether it's a file itself or whether it's a shortcut, any of those kinds of things relating to my user experience are going to be part of my profile. Now for servers like this, which is my domain controller, we don't usually get too customized with that and download custom screensavers, apart from the fact that they can have viruses in them and worms and that kind of thing. We just don't do that much with servers. But your users, which are going to be the ones taking advantage of user profiles for the most part, at least in terms of customizing them, are going to be the ones that are using Windows XP Professional, where they have a little bit more liberty to do that kind of thing. For example, here I'm logging on as the user Smells, and as we log on to this, we see that they get kind of a default Windows XP desktop and everything. They get this verdant green meadow that gives them calming feelings of world peace and all that kind of stuff. Makes them feel like singing tunes from The Sound of Music and all that kind of thing. You know, The Hills Are Alive and all that stuff. Anyway, so we get all of this stuff that relates to our user environment. Now, many of these settings are stored in a file called ntuser.dat, and that's part of a registry file that's loaded when the user account logs on. Now, switching quickly back over here to the User Accounts Profile tab, this is where the profiles relate to a roaming user profile. If I put something in the profile path here, then that will then become a roaming user profile. And what we'll do here is to enter in a network location. In this case, it's going to be DC Nugget 1 with a share of profiles. And then we're going to give it a specific subdirectory for each individual user, and you can type in the name of the user, or I just usually type in %username %. It will automatically enter in the user's name inside of this variable once I click OK or Apply. Now what I have to do also is to create that folder, so let me right-click here and choose Create New Folder, and we'll call this just the Profiles folder to make it more intuitive. And then I'm going to right-click on it and choose its properties because there's a specific sharing that we want to do. In Windows 2000 or previous operating systems, you'd click Share This Folder, and by default the permissions were everyone full control. That was a security vulnerability in many instances, but as far as your profiles share, as well as the home share, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, you can make this full control. That will not be really a security vulnerability because each individual user's subdirectory underneath this share will have only specific permissions set on it and not everyone full control. So we'll OK that and OK that. And now once that's been done, I can go back into this, and let me just click Apply so you can see that. It does change this user's name automatically to Smells for this location. So we'll just OK this, and now when this user logs off of this user account, logs off of this desktop, their settings can be saved up to that profiles share. So now if the user is logged off, then there's where their profile is stored. It's really just a series of files and folders. That's what the profile is, in addition to a file that includes all of the registry settings, which dictate things such as the screensaver they've chosen and all that kind of stuff. Now in reality, by the way, all profiles are at least a local profile. For example, here on this server, if I go under Documents and Settings, I see some user accounts that have logged on, most particularly the trainer account. Here are all the files relative to that trainer's profile. Now in terms of the roaming profile, if I had one here, it would copy it from this Documents and Settings location, just like it'll copy it from the Documents and Settings location on the Windows XP computer, and copy it to this profiles share up here. And then here's where all of the user files and folders are here. And then here's the registry file I mentioned to you a little while ago. So really the difference between a local profile and a roaming profile is that a local profile only keeps the profile in Documents and Settings on the local machine. A roaming profile will copy it from Documents and Settings to the profiles share. And then it's only going to copy on subsequent copies only new or changed files to this profiles share. Likewise, when this user logs onto some other computer, it's going to take this directory here, copy it down to the local Documents and Settings on whichever other computer they log on to, and it's going to provide them their exact same user environment. And that's why we call it a roaming profile, because they can go to any computer in the environment and get the exact same settings no matter where they go. And so we really wind up with 4 different kinds of profiles. There's the local profile, which is only stored in Documents and Settings. The roaming profile, which copies from Documents and Settings to a profile share on a server somewhere. By the way, that share should ideally be on some other computer besides the domain controller, just for load balancing purposes. Then there's also a temporary profile. This is going to be the case if a user logs on and sits down at their computer, and at the time that they're logging on, the profiles server or the profile share is somehow unavailable. Well, the Windows XP computer locally, or whatever current Windows operating system, will detect that there's no profile share available, and it will give them a message that they have to click on to click OK, and it simply says that the roaming profile's not available. Then it's just going to load their local settings, if they have any, out of Documents and Settings, but any changes they make will not be kept permanent. They will be discarded when the user logs off. Then there's a mandatory profile as well. Let's go ahead and address that. Now, in order to configure this mandatory profile, I've logged on as the trainer account, and what I'm going to do is to select a user account that's already got a local profile here that's already been configured the way I want it. I'm just going to use my Samuel Mells account. It pretty much has the same desktop you see here. And we're going to say that that's what we want for our company standard, for example. And I'll go to my computer to right-click on it and choose Properties to get to the System Properties. Or I want to go to the Advanced tab and the User Profiles frame down here in the middle to click on Settings and to select the Samuel Mells account. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy it to a specific location, which is going to be DC Nugget 1, Profiles, and then I'm going to put a folder up there called Mandatory. It doesn't already exist. Once I click OK here, it will create the Mandatory Profile folder and put all of the necessary files and folders in that location. Then the other thing I can do is to click on Permitted to Use, and I'm just going to give this to everyone, and I'm going to go to the NuggetLab.com domain and give everyone in the NuggetLab.com, everyone, the ability to use it, because this is going to be kind of a pretty wide open profile. It doesn't have much security risk in it or anything like that, or any risk of administrative burden on it, because the users can't change the profile anyway once I'm done making it mandatory. But right now it's not quite yet mandatory. I'll click OK here. It's going to copy the profile up to that mandatory directory, but I'm not quite done yet making it a mandatory profile yet. Let me go ahead and show you what still needs to be done. Here's where it's copied the profile up to the profile share, so we're OK with that. But this still says ntuser.dat. In order to make it a mandatory profile, you change the name of this registry file to ntuser.man, and now anybody that's directed to this profile's share, to this mandatory directory, is going to get a mandatory user profile. So let's go ahead and go to a user account and give them the mandatory profile. I'll go to Helga Hinkle here, and I'll go to her profile tab, and I'll just give her a location of DC Nugget 1 profiles mandatory. So we'll click OK on that. And now when Helga Hinkle logs on, she's going to get that mandatory profile that we just saw. She'll be able to change anything she wants, but it will not stick, it will not be permanent, because the next time she logs on, she'll go right back to the same settings. This is very handy, and let me log this out while I'm talking about it. This is very handy for public environments such as a kiosk out in a lobby, public libraries, those kinds of things, where you want every user to be able to log on and get the same exact settings, and if they change anything or vandalize the desktop somehow, then when they log back off, it just goes right back to what it used to be. Now here I've gone ahead and logged on as my Helga Hinkle account. And what I want to do is, let's say Helga doesn't like this grassy green meadow. She wants something a little bit different, so she'll right-click here, choose Properties, go to her desktop, and she'll just choose, anything else, something else. So we'll go to the Red Moon Desert, whatever that is. We'll click OK here, and then she gets this new desktop. Oh, by the way, just a little trivia point for you. Did you know that originally this was supposed to be the default desktop for Windows XP during its beta phases? They changed it to the verdant green meadow later on because people started calling this, in the beta phases, they started calling this the two-moon interface. Can you think of why? Well, there's one moon, and if you use your imagination a little bit, you can kind of see another moon in here as well. So somebody at Microsoft had a knee-jerk reaction, and they said, we're not going to have this called the two-moon desktop or anything like that. So they went to the grassy green meadow instead. Now you just saw me log that user off. And now we're logging back on again, and we're going to see that the settings did not stick where she had chosen that different wallpaper. Likewise, if she had put any documents on the desktop, those would be discarded. All that kind of stuff goes away because she now has a mandatory user profile. And anybody else that I configure to point to, configure their user account, to point to that same mandatory desktop profile are going to get those settings. By the way, let me also point out another thing here. Notice that as the administrator, I at free will can just browse through all of this stuff, and I can look at any of the things that I've got on here. I can just go through the file system or to Samuel Mells' file system, to his desktop settings, all of this kind of stuff at will. Normally, you can't do that, and by default, I would get an access denied message because I don't have the administrator account in the ACL on those particular files or those particular folders. Now let me take just a brief tangent here to give you what I call a 10-cent tip. And after you've listened to this tip, if you feel that it really was worth 10 cents, you can send me a dime. And those of you that don't like it, you're just going to tell me, frankly, my dear, I don't give a dime. I am just on a roll today. Kill me. And I'm sure you want to kill me too. Okay, let's go ahead and get started with this. What I want to do here is to go to the properties of my computer again, to go to the profile settings here once again. Now, let me just pause here to explain what I want to do. What I want to do is to configure a default domain profile. This is not a mandatory profile where everyone has the same settings and they are forced to keep the same settings. This is kind of a compromise. This is a setting where when they log on for the first time, I want everybody to get the exact same settings, the same company wallpaper, color scheme, mouse pointers, whatever else we have, screensaver. And I just want that to be a starting point, but they can change it. So it's not like a mandatory profile in that respect, because they start with the same thing, but they can change it. So what I'll do is find a profile that I like. I'll just select this, and I'll choose copy to, and I'll browse to a specific location on a domain controller. Now this will not be the profile server. This will be a domain controller, and my domain is nuggetlab.com. DCNugget1 is the name of the server, and I'm going to go to the sysvol share, and then to the name of the domain, and then down to scripts, and click OK, and then I'm going to tack on to the end of this default user. And that will now be the default domain user profile, and everybody will get this profile. And of course, again, we would give everyone the ability to use it from out of the appropriate domain in this case, so everyone will be permitted to use it. Now, anybody that's already logged on to the domain, this will not apply to, but if I hire a new employee today and they're logging on for the first time, they're going to get this default user profile from the domain. I'll just click OK here, and we'll see that it then copies it into this location where we have the default user location, and then there's all of the settings related to that profile. Now let's talk briefly about home directories. A home directory has a good advantage in that it's going to normally be stored on a server, like a file and print server, for example, and it gives us a centralized point for virus scanning and things like backup. This is much better than each individual user using just the My Documents folder, which is a local folder that's stored within their user profile. In addition to that, if they store a lot of large documents in that My Documents local user profile item, then if they have roaming profiles, then every time they log off and log back on, then it's going to transfer potentially large documents up and down the network, and that's going to really tax your network situation. So it might be better to map home drives for your individual users. In order to do that, we're first going to go ahead and create a home directory. So we'll just right-click here on the C drive where I am right now. It doesn't have to be your C drive, but just whatever drive is available to you. And I'm going to call this home just to make it intuitive. Now I'm also going to go to the properties of this, and the sharing is again going to be for everyone full control, because the subdirectories where everyone's actual content is stored in customized folders for each individual user is going to be dedicated to simply that user's account, and everyone will not have access to it. So now we need to configure one or more user accounts to take advantage of the home directory. So I'll go to my Samuel Mells account, to his profile, and I'll connect it to drive H for a network drive. And I usually make it drive H so that it corresponds with home, so users can easily identify what it is. You could make it a local path, but that would just be local relative to the user's logon, and it would be their local drive C or whatever. And that is not centralized, so it's usually not a good idea. So I'll just go ahead and fill this in with DCNugget1 home, and then %username%. Once I've done that, I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and then I'm going to log on as that specific user. And you see here now I've logged on as Samuel Mells, and we have the document open here out of the home directory open at drive H, and this is pointing to his home directory share. So we'll right-click here now, choose New, and he's going to go ahead and just create some document here. It doesn't matter what it is. We'll just call it Samuel's Projects or something like that. So once we've gone ahead and called it Samuel's Projects, we'll go ahead and go back to the file system on the actual server where that share is located under the home directory. And now here's the smells directory. Let me just quickly tangent here to go to the properties so we can go to the security properties of it. So you can see that indeed the everyone permission is not set on this, and it's indeed given Samuel Mells full control and administrators full control. We do have users here that have read and execute list folder contents and read access. And you might look at that and say, James, you say that as if it's a good thing. Well, it's not, because that means that any user can then just read and execute list folder contents and read that person's particular document. So what we'd want to do this to control that from a higher level, we could go to the security permissions on the home directory where we have this user's item here, but if we try to remove it, we'll get a message saying we can't because it's being inherited from a level up above. And if we click on advanced, we see that it's inheriting the permissions from the parent, which in this case would be the root of the drive. So we can deselect this and then copy the existing permissions. This kind of gives us now a template off of which we can work. And then I'm just going to now manually remove the user's security group and then click OK. Once I've done that, if we go back into the Mr. Mells account here, and we go to the security item, we see that it has removed the user's security group, and now it's no longer just generic people, it's all the administrators as well as this individual user that have access to that folder. Now let's take a look at another potential problem here. Here I've got Samuel Mills, and he goes to my computer and he's working with documents and all that stuff. But generally speaking, users have a tendency to ignore their home directory. The administrators send out emails. They say everybody stores stuff on your home directory. That's where we do backup, viruses, all that kind of stuff. And yet people will inevitably ignore us, and they will still save things to My Documents. And that's partially because a lot of the applications, such as Microsoft Office, will default to My Documents for the users to be able to store documents. So they'll go ahead and create documents here, and he's got a document there called Appointments and all this kind of stuff. So now you get this other situation where you got some users that remember some of the time to store things in their home directory. Other times they put things in My Documents. That's just because that's where the default location is for their application. So now they got documents scattered hither and yon. Well, what we want to do now with Windows Server 2003 is to redirect everybody. You probably think I'm going to say to the home directory, but I'm really going to say to My Documents. Well, that doesn't make sense. Why would we do that? Isn't that part of the local profile? Well, it is, but there's also a policy that we can configure to redirect My Documents to the home directory. So basically what we're going to tell the users is, okay, you people win. We can't tell you to save anything to your home directory anymore. Just go ahead and save it to My Documents. Doesn't matter, because we're going to still save it to their home directory, but we're going to do it surreptitiously and through a policy. So here's how that's going to work. I'm going to go to an organizational unit here, and once again, we'll look more at policies a little bit later on, but we'll go to the Group Policy tab here, and I'm going to choose a new policy. We'll just name this something intuitive. We'll just call this, Phoenix Policy. And we'll go ahead and edit this policy, and now I'm going to redirect their My Documents. So we'll go into the Windows Settings, Folder Redirection, go to My Documents here, and go to its Properties under this policy. Now the default setting is not configured. I'm going to set it up to a basic redirection, so it's going to redirect everyone's folder to the same location. You can also choose Advanced, which would direct people to various locations based upon their user groups. And then as far as the target folder location is concerned, I can redirect to the user's home directory. Alternatively, you see some other options there. I could create a folder for each user under a root path. That's similar to what we've done in Windows 2000. Or I could redirect to a specific following location or to a profile location, which is inadvisable because now you've got user data intermixed with user profile stuff. That's what used to happen under Windows 95, for example. That was a big mess. So we'll just redirect everyone to the user's home directory, and we can click OK here. Before we do that, let me show you some other settings here as well, though, before I forget. On the settings here, I can also grant the user exclusive rights to My Document. More importantly, it'll also move the contents of their existing My Documents, their local My Documents, in their profile to the new location. So that way, we don't lose any documents, we don't have anything missing. Also, we can leave the folder in the new location if we decide to remove this policy. Even after this policy is gone, if we delete it or something like that, they're still going to be redirected to the home directory via My Documents. Alternatively, we could redirect them back to the local user profile, and we can make My Pictures a subfolder of My Documents or not. Okay, so this is all good for what we've got here. We'll click OK, close that up, and then once we've finished this all up, we're going to go ahead and log back on as one of our users. So now here I've logged on as Samuel Mills, and I'm going to go to his documents. And first of all, I'm just going to put this on the desktop just to make it easier. So I'll show it on the desktop. And once we get here, we'll go to its properties, and you'll see that we can reconfigure this under normal circumstances through the buttons that we will have available down here. But now that I've used a policy to forcibly redirect it to this location, that's where it's going to go. I can't backspace over this. I'm hitting backspace. Nothing happens. That is just where it's going to go. And in fact, if I double-click My Documents, I should see two documents in there because there was the one that I put manually in My Documents, and then there was the one that was also put in the home directory. Now they're both combined into one because of the settings from within the group policy object, which copied the contents of the local My Documents documents to this redirected folder. And the real beauty of this is the users still think they're just using My Documents, and they're none the wiser. And if they still go back over instead, go ahead and use their home drive instead, doesn't matter because that's where they're actually saving documents anyway. And if we double click on the home drive, we'll see that again, he has the same two documents there. It's just an all roads lead to Rome kind of thing. They both get to the same place now. Now, as far as user accounts are concerned, there's something that's critical that you should understand, and that is some settings that are within a group policy object under Active Directory Users and Computers, which is where I'm headed right now. And then under the domain here, I'll right-click to choose Properties to get to the properties of the domain, to get ultimately to this default domain policy. Now, that's where we're going to be configuring all of our password policies for the user accounts. So to get to this, we can click on Edit down there at the bottom. There's a button, or I just usually double click on it and it opens it up. And then what we'll do here is to get into the Windows settings, security settings, then we'll go to account policies and password policy. So let's take a look at what these different things are. The 24 passwords remembered is meant to defeat users that when it comes time for them to change their password with this interface, whatever their old password is, they just type that in. And then for the new password, they enter in the same thing, whatever that is. And then the confirmed password, of course, they enter in the same thing. And then they just basically keep their same password. They kind of think they're tricking the system into thinking that it's different, when it's really not. Well, the enforced password history means that it's going to remember the last passwords that they've chosen until they get to the 25th password. And then that relates to this one as well, and I'm not going in order because this directly relates to the history. The minimum password age also states that I have to keep that password for at least a day. Well, again, users might want to try to change their password, but they're going to have to wait at least 24 days before they can do that because they have to keep the password for a day, and they have to change the password 24 times before they can get back to the 25th password, which they're hoping would be their previous password. Then there's the maximum password age, meaning they have to change it within 42 days. And then the minimum password length of 7 characters, which is always a good recommended minimum setting. And you can go up to 127 characters unless you have down-level Windows, which means things like Windows 95, Windows 98, that kind of thing. And if that's the case, you're going to be limited to 14 characters because of LAN manager restrictions. You also have to make sure that the password meets complexity requirements by default. That means you have alpha, numeric, upper lowercase, and special characters in your password. And you have to have 3 of the 4 items in that in order to meet a complexity requirement. And then finally, this store password using reversible encryption item is very similar to what we saw in the user account. Actually, it's the same thing. Storing the password using reversible encryption was stored on the local hard disk, and someone could reverse encrypt that password. Not a recommended practice, and you should always leave this disabled. And then as we move down here to the account lockout policy, there are 3 critical settings here. This has an account lockout threshold. That's the one we really ought to cover first. That says after how many invalid logon attempts should we lock this account. And a common setting would be 3. So if the user enters in the incorrect password 3 times in a row, and I'll just OK this, then what will happen is it will lock out the account for a specific duration, and they're suggesting 30 minutes here. And if I click OK here, that's what it's going to go ahead and set these to. So it suggests 30 minutes. So this would mean the person has to run around and find a help desk person or go get a coffee break or something like that. And when they come back, the account will be unlocked again. Then they can also reset the account lockout after 30 minutes. Now, if they've already logged on incorrectly 3 times, this doesn't really have much relevance. But if they've already logged on incorrectly twice, then the counter has counted up to 2. And then if they just walk off when they go to a meeting or something like that and they come back 30 minutes later, that counter is reset to 0, and they again have 3 logon attempts to make before getting locked out. So now we click OK through all of that, and these are the settings we would be wound up with. Well, that was good English. These are the settings we would be wound up with. Whew, must be late. Can hardly tell I used to be an English major. And then I won't exhaust these settings, but there are certain other settings under local policies that I think I should point out, and that's under the security options. This relates to smart cards, which we're also talking about in this nugget, and that's why I'm going down into this section. And that is down here, it's somewhere if I can see the forest for the there it is. Interactive logon requires smart card, and of course the smart card is just a credit card device, size device that you put into a smart card reader, and you have to have that in order to log on if you enable this policy setting the way I've selected it here. Otherwise, you'll be able to use both a username and password or a smart card if you have a smart card and a reader. You can also set up the interactive logon for smart card removal behavior. If you're at your desk, you've logged on with a smart card, and then you go to the water fountain, should you take the smart card with you? And if you do and pull it out of the reader, what happens? Well, it gives you a choice of a number of different options. Number 1, it can lock the workstation. That's a recommended practice. I strongly recommend that. And then number 2, it could force a log off, but that may also cause you to lose data in applications where you've not yet saved your files. Let's talk a little bit about what smart cards are. Smart cards give you 2-factor authentication, and that you have both something that you know, that is your password or your PIN is what they call it on a smart card, and you also have the physical smart card itself. And here's what a smart card looks like. It's a credit card sized device with some contacts on it, and I just happen to be using GemSafe smart cards, but there are several other vendors out there from Schlumberger, Rainbow, and others. And this is what the actual contact looks like on it. Underneath this, there's some kind of a substrate that's all laminated together, and there's actually a rudimentary processor under there, and some memory that's available as well. And that's where you're going to store some pretty critical security information, most notably certificates, and that's what's going to be used to authenticate users in a Windows Server 2003 environment. And then you'll take this smart card and you'll put it inside of this reader and just slip it in so that it'll look something like this. And now you have the smart card contacts in contact with the reader in this, which is in turn connected somewhere through usually a USB interface to the actual workstation or server. Let's go ahead and discuss some of the underlying components for a smart card logon. First thing you really need is a public key infrastructure, or PKI, and Microsoft's implementation of that will be a certificate authority which you can install through add remove programs in Control Panel. And for smart card logons, you're going to need to install an Enterprise CA. And the reason for that is because an Enterprise CA can dig into Active Directory and look at user accounts, and it kind of interoperates with our user accounts. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at the certification authority here on the Start menu in the Administration Tools. Now in this, we see that we have DC Nugget 1 where I've already installed this, and what we've got that's most important to look at so far right now is the certificate templates. Now, I've already added two of these in here, Smart Card User and Enrollment Agent, otherwise they would not appear, and the way I got them in here was by right-clicking and choosing New Certificate Template to Issue, and then you can pick them out of a list out over here. Now let's go ahead and discuss what these two certificates are used for. First of all, you will often have a user in an organization that is the enrollment agent, one or more persons being the enrollment agent. And this is someone that has the ability to place certificates on a smart card on behalf of another user, and we're going to see how to do that shortly here. Now, I didn't really need to have this in my case because I'm going to enroll on behalf of another user as the domain admin, and I already have that authority to be able to do that. We also have the smart card user item right here as well. This is going to give a smart card logon for client authentication and secure email as well if we want. Now the means by which we're going to be able to put certificates on the smart card is by opening a web browser to the server that is the certificate holder. And this is going to be our CA right here, DC Nugget 1, and then search serve at the end of this and you can see the address up here. I'm doing this directly on DC Nugget 1, that's where I'm seated right now, but I can also do this from across the network from anywhere, and I could do it from a Windows XP computer or whatever. Now what I'm going to do here is to request a certificate. Once I click request a certificate, I could choose user certificate, but that's pretty much going to give me a personal certificate for my own purposes, and it's not going to put it on a smart card. To do that, I need an advanced certificate request, and I'm going to choose this last option that you see here, which does just what it says, request a certificate for a smart card. There are ActiveX controls that are going to be launched. I'm going to have to click on yes to any prompts, and you may need to go into your tools, internet options, security, and then you may need to customize the level for your local intranet to at least enable or prompt ActiveX controls, because some of them are disabled by default in some browsers. Now, I chose to use a smart card user, and that's got a certification authority here of DC Nugget 1. I'm using the GemSafe cards, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. There's a cryptographic service provider for that. And I'm using the administrator's signing certificate of the trainer account. Now, if I wanted to use someone else's certificate, then I could select a certificate and browse for that certificate. In our case, I'm just going to go ahead and use it as is, and I've got a user to select the certificate for. So let's say that I will have Helga Hinkle, who I'm putting in charge of a server, and I want her to be able to use a more secure logon than the rest of my user populace. I want her to be able to use that smart card. So I'll select her, and I'll just enter in Helga Hinkle. I think if I just type HH, yeah, that's it. It's going to give me Helga Hinkle at nuggetlab.com. And then all I got to do is to hit enroll. My smart card is already in the reader, the same ones that I just took a photograph of and showed you to a moment ago. So I click enroll, and then what it's going to do is it's going to interoperate with a little bit of a software interface from GemSafe. And it's going to ask me to enter in a PIN. By default on GemSafe card is 1, 2, 3, 4. Other vendors have default PINs that you can enter in as well. And you can change that, and of course that's going to be advisable in reality. You don't want it to leave it at the default PIN. And then it's generating the key pair for me and placing them on that smart card. And then that's pretty much it. I now have that certificate on the smart card, and you can view the certificate if you want to look at more detail about it, see the certification path. As long as you don't have any red X's in this, in the short version, as long as you don't have any red X's anywhere there, your certificate should be just fine. And then if you have other users you want to enroll also, you can just click New User, and this is often what will be the case if you do have an enrollment agent, which has, new employees lined up, or students in a campus lined up, and it's the first day of school or whatever, and they're using new certificates and all that kind of stuff. You can just do one new user at a time and go on and on and on through the list. Alright, well that's pretty much it for that. Let's go ahead and take a look at using a smart card and see how we log on with it. Alright, let's take a look at how we're actually going to log on using a smart card then. Notice there's a slight difference in the way the logon screen appears here. It gives you the little smart card reader symbol, meaning that it does detect that one is attached. Now I could still use Control-Alt-Delete like usual, just like this, and still enter in a password if I want, unless on the specific user account we've required a smart card logon, or in the computer policy, and we'll look again at policies later on, as I mentioned. In the computer policy, you can also require that at specific computers, within a certain scope of management, they have to use a smart card. In this case, I'm just going to go ahead and put the smart card in, even though I could use a normal logon. I put the smart card in, it automatically detects the smart card when I put it in there, and it asks me for the PIN. So I'll press that, and I'll type that in and click OK. And then it's going to go ahead and log on my user, Helga Hinkle, on the basis of the certificates that are on this smart card. And that's pretty much it. Helga Hinkle now just logs on, and she's got a logon normally through her smart card reader, which we see down here. Oh, don't you love this tour of Windows XP thing that we get all the time? Anyway, so there's Helga Hinkle, and she's now logged on successfully. In this nugget, we talked about user authentication, and of course the first thing you have to do when you talk about user authentication is to have a user account. So we created a user account, we looked at the various attributes related to it, and several of them specifically relating to security, because that's, after all, inherent in authentication. We took a look at user profiles as well, which seems like it's just a preferential thing, what kind of wallpaper they have and that kind of thing. But it does lend to their productivity because they're going to be more productive, users are, if they have a familiar environment. And there's 4 kinds of profiles that we looked at. Most importantly, were mandatory and roaming user profiles. And then we also took a look at the home directory, which is a great way to centralize data, and it's also a great way to do things like centralized virus scanning and the like. And then we can correlate that through a policy so that the home directory and the My Documents directory are really the same thing, and the user might be none the wiser. And then we took a look at the security settings as well, relating especially to the password policy so that we can set up a secure setting for our passwords. And then we took a look at smart cards as well, which is where we have 2-factor authentication, both a physical device that we possess and a PIN or a password for that smart card. And of course, I think one of the most important things that we learned here was that I should probably stop making puns with names like Samuel Mells or Smells. Well, sometimes my sense of humor just stinks. Oh, did I just say that? Anyway, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.